All right, let's dive in. Today, we're tackling a Supreme Court ruling that's shaking things up for international couples.
Oh yeah, this one's a big one.
Huge. Picture this. You're a U.S. citizen, ready to say I do, but your fiance's visa gets denied out of the blue.
Happens more often than you'd think.
Exactly what happened in Department of State v. Munoz.
6-3 decision really sets a precedent for how Americans can fight back against these denials.
And the reason behind the denial in this case, look at this, tattoos.
Yeah, we'll get into that. Raises all sorts of questions about cultural bias and how these decisions are made.
Definitely a lot to unpack there. But first, let's break down what happened in this case.
Right, so the case shines a light on this thing called consular nonreviewability.
Okay, consular nonreviewability. Sounds intimidating.
Basically, it shields decisions made by U.S. consular officers from court challenges.
So, like, what they say goes.
Pretty much. You can see how it might have come about, right? National security, efficiency, all that. They deal with tons of applications.
Makes sense. But it also sounds like it could create some tricky situations for families.
Oh, absolutely. And this case is a prime example.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Okay, so the principle has a long history. Goes back to the early 1900s. It's been challenged a bunch of times, but...
But the Supreme Court keeps upholding it.
Exactly. It keeps solidifying its power, especially when it comes to immigration.
So, how many people are we actually talking about here?
Well, the State Department says tens of thousands of spousal visas are denied every year.
Wow. Tens of thousands.
For all sorts of reasons. Finances, questions about the marriage.
But a lot of them come down to the consular officer's opinion.
You got it. And that's where things get murky.
All right, let's get into the nitty-gritty of Munoz. This case is about Sandra Munoz, a civil rights lawyer, and her husband, Luis Asensio Cordero.
From El Salvador.
Right. They were trying to get him a visa, but it was denied because they thought he was in a gang.
Based on his tattoos.
Tattoos. Seriously.
Yeah, it's a controversial issue, right?
Right.
I mean, can you really judge someone's character based on their ink?
Especially when he had a clean record.
And they even had an expert, a cultural anthropologist, who said the tattoos weren't gang-related.
But the consular officer's decision stood, no review.
Consular non-reviewability in action.
This is why this case is causing such a stir. It's not just about tattoos, it's about the power these officers have.
And how that power can be misused.
Exactly. It makes you wonder, how do we balance national security with the rights of U.S. citizens and their families?
That's the million-dollar question. This case really throws that tension into sharp relief.
It does. So we've got this historical precedent, a huge impact on people's lives, and this core tension at play. What I'm really interested in is, what happens now? What does this ruling mean for other couples in this situation?
Well, honestly, I think the biggest worry is that it could make consular officers even more likely to deny visas based on flimsy evidence.
Oh, that's concerning.
It is. And with the bar for judicial review set so high, it's going to be even harder to fight back against these decisions.
Yeah, it really does feel like they're up against a wall.
It's a tough spot to be in. And to make matters worse, it's totally different in other countries.
Really? How so?
Well, take Canada, for example. They've got this thing called the Immigration and Refugee Board.
Okay.
It's like a separate body that handles visa appeals. If you think you've been treated unfairly, you can actually challenge the decision.
So there are other ways to do this. Other countries have found a way to add some checks and balances.
Yep. And it seemed to work for them.
Makes you wonder why the U.S. is so resistant to that kind of approach.
Well, there are arguments in favor of consular non-reviewability.
I bet there are.
The main one is efficiency. They argue that the system needs to move quickly.
Makes sense with so many applications.
Exactly. And they also say the consular officers, being stationed abroad and all, are the best judges of these situations.
Because they have that local expertise.
Right.
I get that. But it still feels like it leaves too much room for things to go wrong, for bias to creep in.
And for life-changing decisions to be made without enough scrutiny.
That's what bothers me the most.
And that's exactly what Justice Sotomayor argued in her dissent.
Oh, she disagreed with the majority.
Big time. She said that national security is important, of course, but it shouldn't trample on basic rights, like the right to marry.
So she's saying that this system, without proper oversight, could be used to unfairly separate families.
That's her argument. She says it creates a real risk of biased and discriminatory decisions.
Wow. So if we know the system has these flaws, what can be done about it? Is there a way to fix it without putting security at risk?
Well, one option is to create a stronger appeals process within the State Department itself.
Okay, so like a higher level of review.
Right. You could have a board made up of experienced immigration officials who would double-check these denials.
That seems reasonable. It would at least give people a fighting chance.
Exactly. Another possibility is to get Congress involved.
To change the law.
Uh-huh. They could make exceptions to consular non-reviewability, specifically for cases involving families.
So in certain situations, judges would be able to review these decisions.
Precisely.
I imagine that would be a tough sell politically. Immigration is such a hot-button issue.
Oh, for sure. But it's not impossible. Change usually starts from the ground up.
Meaning?
Advocacy groups, the ACLU, ALA, these organizations are already fighting for immigrants' rights. They could put pressure on Congress to act.
And raise awareness about these issues.
Exactly. They can tell the stories of these families and show the human cost of these policies.
That's so important. It's easy to get lost in the legal jargon and forget that real people are being affected.
Absolutely. And these groups provide a lifeline for those families. They offer legal advice, emotional support, connect them with resources. They can be a real source of strength.
It sounds like they play a crucial role. So this case, Munoz, it feels like it could be a turning point.
Yeah, I think it has the potential to spark some real change, whether it's through the courts, legislation, or public pressure.
It's definitely brought these issues to the forefront of the conversation.
It has. And that's a good thing. This debate needs to happen.
So where do we go from here? What are the potential ripple effects of this ruling? And what can people do if they find themselves in a similar situation?
Yeah, it really feels like we're at a crossroads here.
I agree.
This ruling could either cement the way things are, or it could be the push for real change.
I think you're right. And a lot depends on who steps up and takes action.
So who are the key players here? Who can make a difference?
Well, Congress, for one.
They could change the law.
They could. They have the power to amend existing laws or even create new ones that address these issues.
Like creating a right to judicial review for certain visa denials?
Exactly. Or setting up a more robust appeals process within the State Department.
That sounds promising, but also like a long shot.
Oh, it would definitely be a long and complicated process, especially with how politically charged immigration is.
Yeah, that's true.
But remember, big changes often start small, with grassroots movements. You're talking about advocacy groups.
Right. Groups like the ACLU and ALA, they're already doing amazing work fighting for immigrants' rights.
And they could really bring attention to this issue.
Absolutely. They can highlight the impact of this ruling, share the stories of families who are being affected, and put pressure on Congress to act.
That's so important, giving a voice to those who might otherwise be overlooked.
Exactly. And these groups provide so much more than just legal expertise.
What do you mean?
Well, they offer emotional support, practical guidance, they connect people with resources. They really help families navigate this complex and often overwhelming system.
It sounds like they're a lifeline for many people.
They truly are.
Okay, so we've talked about Congress, advocacy groups, but what about the individuals themselves? What can someone like Sandra Munoz do after a ruling like this?
The most important thing is to get a good lawyer, an immigration attorney who specializes in these kinds of cases.
So even with this ruling, there might still be some legal options.
Potentially. A skilled lawyer can assess the situation, figure out if there are any grounds for challenging the denial, and guide them through the process.
Because even though judicial review is limited, it's not completely off the table.
Right. And they can also help gather more evidence, build a strong case, and even pursue appeals through other channels within the State Department.
That's good to know. It gives some hope, at least.
It does. And beyond the legal stuff, connecting with those advocacy groups we talked about can make a world of difference.
For support and guidance.
Exactly. They can offer a sense of community, share their knowledge and experience, and empower people to stand up for their rights.
This has been such an insightful deep dive. It's been heavy at times, but also hopeful.
I agree. It's a complicated issue, but it also highlights the incredible strength and resilience of families.
It really does. So, as we wrap things up, is there one key takeaway you want our listeners to ponder? What's the big question we should all be asking ourselves?
I think the question is this: how can we as a nation find that balance between keeping our country safe and protecting the right to family unity? It's a question that goes beyond the legal arguments and touches on our core values as a society.
It's a powerful question and one that deserves a lot of thought and discussion. This case, with all its twists and turns, reminds us that behind the laws and policies, there are real people with real lives. So to our listeners, we encourage you to stay informed, keep talking about these issues, and maybe even find ways to use your voice to advocate for a more just and compassionate immigration system. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.